Lines you wouldn't hear in a superhero movie.
Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Whatever it is, it's heading straight for the World Trade Center.
Has there ever been a more iconic character than Superman? First appearing in Action Comics 1, authored and illustrated by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the character has become an unmistakable icon of American pop culture. From his debut in 1938, Superman's influence completely changed the creative direction of the American comics industry, with the character effectively inspiring an entirely new genre that has permanently altered the media landscape. The superhero genre has completely dominated American comics for almost a century, while adaptations of popular superhero characters have become some of the most successful films, TV shows, and video games ever released. Almost every single superhero can trace their creative origin to Superman, so with the overwhelming presence of superhero adaptations in film and television over the last decade, it seems odd that Superman himself is noticeably kind of absent. With the proven success and popularity of superhero stories, it seems obvious that film studios should capitalize with a new adaptation of the genre's original iconic character. And well, they definitely tried. In 2013, Warner Bros. Released the now infamous Man of Steel, a $225 million Superman movie written by David S. Goyer and directed by Zack Snyder that was supposed to kickstart an entire cinematic universe. But even though the film technically succeeded financially, its reception among critics and fans proved a bit more controversial. While some people praise the film as an interesting reinterpretation of the character, many fans were left unsatisfied with the movie's portrayal of Superman, and the film's overall writing quality in general. So with the latest cinematic Superman adaptation arriving this year, I wanted to revisit Warner Bros.' previous attempt to bring the character to the big screen, to re-examine the critical problems of Man of Steel, and discover how you fail at Superman. For context, let's start with a quick history lesson. While superhero adaptations have always made for popular blockbusters, the cultural and financial dominance of superhero films really began with the MCU. Starting in the early 2010s, Disney Studios began using their limited rights to Marvel Comics characters to create a series of interconnected films dubbed the Marvel Cinematic Universe. A long-term experiment that paid off with the 2012 crossover movie Avengers, which broke box office records to become the highest-grossing comic book film yet released. Seeing this success and recognizing the potential, Warner Bros. Decided to emulate this model to build their own cinematic universe by using their rights to characters from the rival brand DC Comics. Their first attempt was a Green Lantern movie starring Ryan Reynolds, but after a disastrous commercial and critical reception, they decided to try a different approach. Now, Warner Bros. Already had a successful ongoing superhero franchise of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, so studio executives decided to capitalize off of this success and approached him to produce a Superman film in the same continuity. But Nolan ultimately refused, since he didn't want his films or characters to be subject or associated with the demands of a wider cinematic universe. Instead, he recommended Zack Snyder. Now, Snyder already had a proven track record with comic book movies, with his incredibly popular adaptation of Frank Miller's 300 and a surprisingly well-received take on Watchmen that made him an obvious choice for creative lead on the project. But more importantly, he shared Nolan's creative vision for a more realistic and grounded portrayal of a character, with Nolan specifically recommending Snyder for his innate aptitude for dealing with superheroes as real characters. This focus on mature realism had defined the movie since its earliest stages of production. As scriptwriter David Goyer described, "What Christopher Nolan and I have done with Superman is trying to bring the same naturalistic approach we adopted for the Batman trilogy. We want our stories to be rooted in reality, like they could happen in the same world we live in." Zack Snyder himself would continue to repeat this sentiment in interviews following the film's release, saying, "I think with Superman, we have the opportunity to place this icon within the sort of real world we live in, and this philosophy explains almost every element of the film's production." This is particularly noticeable in the cinematography. In contrast to the deliberate framing and long exposure of Snyder's earlier work, the photography of Man of Steel was deliberately more unpolished and naturalistic. The camera work was specifically chosen to imitate documentary footage, with techniques like unfocused snap zooms and handheld shaky cam used frequently to make the footage feel like real recordings taken from an in-universe perspective. There was also an increased focus on detailing in the environment and costume design, especially for the film's alien elements. In keeping with Goya's earliest conceptions of the film dealing with the conflict between Superman's upbringing and alien origins, extra attention was dedicated to fleshing out the visual design of his home planet Krypton, including conceptual architecture, wildlife design, and even creating an original written language. If you look closely, this language is actually featured in the texture details of Superman's suit, which was also redesigned with classic elements like the belt and tights replaced with decorative piping and matching cuffs to make it feel more regal and alien. In general, there was a deliberate effort to differentiate Man of Steel from existing conceptions of a character. This wasn't your grandpa's Superman. As Goya described, "We're approaching Superman as if it weren't a comic book movie, as if it were real. I adore the Donner films, absolutely adore them. It just struck me that there was an idealist quality to them that may or may not work with today's audience." Again, just like the Dark Knight trilogy, Man of Steel was specifically intended to reimagine a version of Superman that would be successful with contemporary audiences. But the most interesting and controversial part of this creative decision was how it affected the filmmaker's approach to characterizing and conflict. Visually and tonally, Man of Steel is noticeably darker than previous Superman movies, with a lot more emphasis on fight scenes and the resulting collateral destruction and the psychological flaws of its characters. Zack Snyder explicitly stated in a 2014 interview with Forbes that, "We really wanted to show it wasn't just like the PG-13 version where everyone just gets up and they're fine. I really wanted to show that the violence is real. People get killed or get hurt and it's not fun or funny." And I think understanding this is the best way to critically approach Man of Steel. Not by complaining about the film's tone or creative direction, but by analysing how well it actually achieves the realistic stakes and character drama the filmmakers were aiming for. So with all that additional context out of the way, let's finally look at the actual content of Man of Steel and see what went wrong with this reimagining of Superman. The first issues with Man of Steel's reimagining of Superman appear in the opening sequence in the additional context it adds to its character's origin story. Like most adaptations, the film opens with the birth of its protagonist on the planet Krypton, with his parents sending him to Earth in a rocket ship just before the planet's destruction. But while this first seems like a standard retelling of a classic mythology, the new details included in this adaptation start to create some issues. For example, in his conversation with the Kryptonian Council, Superman's father Jor-El highlights the imminent danger while stressing the need to evacuate. And this is how that conversation goes.
Do you not understand? Krypton's core is collapsing. We may only have a matter of weeks. I warned you. Harvesting the core was suicide. It has accelerated the process of implosion.
Our energy reserves were exhausted. What would you have us do, Al?
Look to the stars. Like our ancestors did. There are habitable worlds within reach. We can begin by using the old outposts.
Are you seriously suggesting that we evacuate the entire planet?
No. Everybody here is already dead.
So this isn't a great start. Apparently in this adaptation, the Council are aware that Krypton's core is collapsing due to their energy mining program. But when Jor-El suggests they evacuate to nearby planets, they dismiss this idea because it would be difficult? Jor-El's dialogue specifically describes habitable worlds within our reach, implying there are livable planets they have the means to travel to. And this lady can't be bothered because they might not get everyone? I mean, you'd think they'd at least try, right? Save themselves at least? It might sound pedantic, but these additional changes really damage this adaptation by making the story far less believable. And for an obvious comparison, just see how much better Superman the Animated Series handles the same material.
Each of you should have my report. It distills all the data I've gathered so far and leaves no doubt that the planet's core is undergoing a mounting chain reaction that will eventually destroy Krypton.
Lunacy. Ask Brainiac.
Yes, Brainiac. He'll tell us.
Unlike Man of Steel, in the animated series, Krypton's council isn't aware of imminent destruction of their planet, and are being deceived by the AI Brainiac telling them everything is normal.
One can appreciate Jor-El's hard work. However, he is still mistaken. As I've stated before, the Temblars are the result of a slight polar shift, no more, and will soon
He's
fade.
wrong! He doesn't know!
This is a much better explanation for their inaction since they have no proof their planet is in danger and are actively being deceived into thinking otherwise. But they're still willing to hear out Jor-El's proposal, which brings us to the next improvement.
Your faith in him will be the end of us all. Act now and we can save everyone.
And how do you propose to do that?
Put everyone in the Phantom Zone.
Again, unlike Man of Steel, where Jor-El's plan is as simple as why don't we just move everyone to a nearby planet, in the animated series, Jor-El suggests storing their population in dimensional prison and transporting them to safety via experimental rocket. This also makes a lot more sense than the movie, since Jor-El's proposal to the Council involves freezing their whole population in stasis prison designed for criminals instead of why don't we just go somewhere else.
You're asking us to voluntarily put ourselves among the vilest criminals in the galaxy? You're mad!
We can restore ourselves later, on another planet. It would only take one man. Listen to me. I've built a ship. Listen, please.
Only 2 minutes into the opening scene, and despite the filmmaker's focus on realism, Man of Steel's approach to the Superman mythos is noticeably worse than the cartoon released nearly 20 years earlier. But things only get worse later in the movie when Clark finds a digital copy of his father's personality on a crashed Kryptonian ship, and he explains more of our planet's history, and we find out how that ship got there.
Long ago, in an era of expansion, our race spread out through the stars, seeking new worlds to settle upon. This scout ship was one of thousands launched into the void. We built outposts on other planets, using great machines to reshape environments to our needs. For 100,000 years, our civilization flourished.
100,000 years. The Kryptonians had access to interstellar travel for 100,000 years, and they all died when Krypton blew up. Right. It's hard to explain how badly this exposition damages the story, so let's break down each problem one by one. See, what makes Superman's tragic origin as the last survivor of Krypton so meaningful is that he was the only one to escape the planet's destruction. But this story really loses its impact if you establish that the rest of them could just leave. In the comics, Clark only survived because his father used his knowledge as a scientist to build an experimental rocket that could travel interstellar distances but only carry one passenger. It was a last resort to save his son, and they couldn't save anyone else because they just didn't have the technology. But Man of Steel establishes Krypton has had this technology for hundreds of centuries, yet none of them decided to leave their exploding planet? This exposition only makes Jor-El's conversation with the Council more absurd in retrospect, because now we know they could order an evacuation and leave at any time, but for some reason they just refuse, and the film never gives us an explanation why. Furthermore, during his monologue, Jor-El specifically describes how Kryptonians spread out to the stars seeking new worlds to settle on, and yet now Krypton is dying because they started mining their planet's core for energy? So, even ignoring the questionable resource logistics of mining a planet's core, it should go without saying that this doesn't make any sense given what we know about Krypton's space exploration. If you have access to interstellar travel, then you essentially have access to unlimited resources. You can go wherever you like and grab whatever you need. So even if they absolutely needed resources from the planet's core for some reason, then why didn't the Kryptonians just mine another planet instead of the one they live on? There are plenty of other planets out there, their options are pretty open. Besides, even if the Council isn't convinced, if the Kryptonians had this technology, then surely Zod or Jor-El could lead some kind of evacuation movement. Who cares if you have a Council's permission, just get people off the planet. All of this demonstrates the first major issue with how Man of Steel reimagines the Superman mythos. Despite all the time the film spends introducing new information, there doesn't seem to be any consideration for how any of these elements actually work together, or what they imply about this world or its characters. The film just presents a bunch of different sci-fi concepts with no concern for how any of them might interact or affect each other. Which is how we get a society with centuries of interstellar travel that all died because none of them left their exploding planet. And this seriously hurts the movie because our suspension of disbelief is constantly being challenged by information that doesn't make sense. Which is bizarre considering the film's production, because with all the time spent aesthetically designing Krypton, you'd think they'd spend more effort developing the history and culture of a planet in a way which better informs the events of a story. But the bigger problem with this type of lazy world building is how this additional context inevitably alters our perception of the film's characters. Which brings us to our final issue. If Krypton has had interstellar travel for 100,000 years, and Jor-El knew the planet was about to explode, then why didn't he just leave? Why not try to save as many people as he could instead of sending Clark to Earth alone? Well, Clark asked this exact same question, and this is the answer.
Why didn't you come with me?
We couldn't, Cal. No matter how much we wanted to. No matter how much we loved you. Your mother, Lara, and I were a product of the failures of our world as much as Zod was, tied to its fate.
Okay, so to really understand the implication of this statement, we need to go back to the introduction scene and another major detail about Kryptonian society. After his meeting with a council is interrupted by Zod's military takeover, Jor-El escapes Zod's soldiers and travels to a location we only fully understand later.
This is a Genesis chamber. All Kryptonians were conceived in chambers such as this. Every child was designed to fulfill a predetermined role in our society. As a worker, a warrior, a leader, so on.
Basically, aside from Clark, all the Kryptonian characters we see in the movie are the product of genetic engineering, which programs them with specialized skills for their role in society. What makes Clark so special is that he was born normally, outside the Genesis chamber and without any modifications. As Jor-El explains, the reason he did this was because he saw genetic engineering as an unethical mistake.
Your mother and I believe Krypton had lost something precious. The element of choice, of chance. What if a child dreamed of becoming something other than what society had intended for him or her? What if a child aspired to something greater?
He even lists Krypton's reliance on genetic engineering as one of the things that led to its downfall.
What happened? Artificial population control was established. The outposts and space exploration were abandoned. We exhausted our natural resources. As a result, our planet's core became unstable.
So when he describes how he and his wife were the product of the failures of our world to explain why they couldn't leave with Clark, he seems to be referencing their nature as genetically modified Kryptonians as the reason they didn't try to leave the planet. Essentially, Jor-El believed that Kryptonian society collapsed as a consequence of our genetic engineering program, and that saving any modified Kryptonians would mean preserving the cultural practices that doomed their society, which explains why he didn't try to save anybody but Clark despite knowing that Krypton was going to blow up and having the technology to evacuate. To put this another way, in Man of Steel, the reason Jor-El didn't bother to save any other Kryptonians was because he didn't believe their lives were worth saving. Holy shit, that is awful. Like, with everything the audience understands about the setting, Jor-El is refusing to save billions of sentient lives because he considers them genetic failures. And what makes this situation somehow worse is that his justification doesn't even make any sense. I mean, his entire plan was to have a normal baby with his wife, proving that genetically modified Kryptonians can still produce unaltered offspring. So even if they only saved engineered Kryptonians, then the population would become completely normal in just one generation. This guy is supposed to be a scientist, how did he not figure this out? The only way you could potentially justify this would be that he was concerned they would eventually default to their programming and restart the cultural practices that doom their society. But this argument still falls apart since Jor-El himself is proof that genetically modified Kryptonians can act outside their society's values. He could have just escaped with a group of people that had similar beliefs. Instead, he chose to let everyone die. Again, this is the problem with lazy world building. A film's setting affects its character writing because the implications of their actions will depend on what we know about their environment. The audience forms their opinion on the characters based on what opportunities we know are available to them versus what they actually decide to do. So if the scriptwriters haven't considered how different elements of a setting will inform their characters' behaviour, then their decisions can have some seriously unfortunate implications. I mean, I doubt the filmmakers intended to characterise Jor-El as an evil nihilistic eugenicist, but this is the only interpretation of his character which makes sense with the information presented by the film. There's no other logical way to explain his actions. But what somehow makes his character writing even worse is that even the most generous explanation of Jor-El's values is still contradicted by some of his seemingly inexplicable decisions. I mean, if Jor-El was really concerned that his genetic programming would make him a negative influence, then why attach a digital copy of his personality to Clark's ship? Why is this exposition scene even happening? Also, for as much importance as Jor-El puts on free will and the right to self-determinism, the advice he gives to Clark is really demanding. Listening to his dialogue with Clark could easily give you whiplash because he constantly switches between encouraging him to choose his own destiny while also demanding that his son assume the role of a savior figure.
Your mother and I believe Krypton had lost something precious. The element of choice, of chance. We wanted you to learn what it meant to be human first, so that one day, when the time was right, you could be the bridge between two peoples. What if a child dreamed of becoming something other than what society had intended for him or her? You can save her, Cal. You can save all of them.
Furthermore, in the climax of the introduction, right before he sends Clark to Earth, Jor-El uses a machine to imbue his son with an item he stole from a Genesis chamber. Later in the film, this weird skull thing is revealed to be the Codex, which contains all the genetic information needed for Kryptonian engineering. and Jor-El decides to store this information in his son's body. But why not just destroy it? I mean, it's clear Kryptonians can reproduce without needing the codex, or Clark's parents couldn't have secretly conceived him before Jor-El stole it. Later in the movie, General Zod's entire plan to rebuild Krypton relies on finding the information from the codex and using it to restart their genetic engineering, which he wouldn't have been able to do if Jor-El didn't store that information in Clark. So if Jor-El really wanted to end genetic engineering, then why not just destroy the codex? Why preserve a technology he spent his whole life fighting against in the body of his infant son? How does that make any sense for his character? These decisions are major driving forces for the plot, but they completely contradict everything the audience understands about Jor-El's values and motivations. In short, he sucks. All of it sucks. Despite spending over 20 minutes on the introduction, and even more exposition to establish the setting, none of this new information is coherent with the actual events of the story. Instead, the changes made to the Superman mythos and the elements introduced by the scriptwriters actively conflicts with his origin story while damaging the morality of his legacy characters. And while Jor-El himself is just a secondary cast member, this type of character writing affects every character in Man of Steel, especially the protagonist. After Krypton finally blows up and the introduction section is finished, the film spends the next sequence of scenes establishing Clark as a character. This is achieved via a non-linear montage that conveys Clark's journey into adulthood by showcasing his lived experiences. So to analyse how this movie handles Clark's character, let's break down each scene chronologically and explore what they establish about his personality and internal conflict. Now, Goyer has stated in interviews that these cuts between Clark's past and present are to indicate how the lessons Clark learned in childhood are informing his current day actions. But when you actually analyse a montage, the adjacent scenes don't really have any relevance to each other. Let me show you what I mean. Our first introduction to Clark shows him working on a fishing boat before hearing a distress call from the US Coast Guard, and helping them rescue a group of oil workers from an exploding sea rig. The next scene cuts to a moment in Clark's childhood where his super senses make him overwhelmed at school, and he locks himself away in a closet before his mum arrives to calm him down. Again, I'm not exactly sure what the relevance between these scenes is supposed to be. Clark isn't being overwhelmed like he was in a flashback. If anything, you'd think learning how to manage his super senses would mean he'd notice this falling fish trap, but whatever. Also, how strong is this guy who tackled him? Gosh. Besides the obvious visual parallel between Clark's relationship with his mum and the wailing calf he sees when he regains consciousness, thematically, this combination doesn't really say anything. But individually, these scenes essentially tell us two things. Firstly, Clark has decided to live anonymously alongside regular humans, but is willing to publicly reveal his powers to save people in danger. Secondly, Clark struggled with adapting with his powers growing up, which ostracized him from his peers, and his parents were his greatest support during this period. So far, this is honestly pretty good stuff. The first scene effectively establishes Clark's current situation for the audience and demonstrates his moral values with him helping people in danger, while the second scene endears him for us through his relationship with his parents while realistically exploring the struggles his superpowers would cause. It's good characterization that efficiently introduces all the important concepts that will be relevant for Clark's character, but it's the way Man of Steel builds on this foundation which starts to create some problems. After the first flashback, the film cuts to Clark stealing some random guy's clothes after getting out of the ocean, before he travels into town and a school bus reminds him of another core memory. While this segment doesn't really achieve anything outside of basic plot progression, and the fact that Clark would rather steal clothes than embarrass himself, the transition is clearly relevant and the next clip is essential since it introduces his internal conflict. The scene opens with Clark being bullied on a bus ride to school before an accident on a bridge sends a vehicle into a river, after which Clark saves his classmates by pushing the school bus ashore. This is one of the better scenes in the montage since it reinforces Clark's existing characterization by showing him feeling outcasted but still committed to saving lives and helping people. I particularly like the detail where you think he's looking at his classmates' reaction to his abilities, but he was actually scanning for anyone he missed, and goes back under the water to fetch the bully. It really highlights his selflessness by showing his priority to protect people over his self-image. But the flashback continues and we see Pete's mum, that's the name of a bully from the school bus, confronting Clark's parents about his role in the accident.
My son was there. He was in the bus. He saw what Clark did.
I know he did. I'm sure what he thought he saw
was an act of God, Jonathan. This was providence.
When Clark storms off, Jonathan goes after him to give him a lecture on the situation.
I just wanted to help.
I know you did, but we talked about this. Right?
It's clear this is a conversation they've had before.
Oh, Clark, you have to keep this side of yourself a secret.
This is an interesting point to lecture on, since if Clark didn't reveal his powers to help his classmates, then everyone on that bus would have drowned. And when Clark asks his dad how he should have handled the situation, this is his response.
What was I supposed to do? Just let him die?
Maybe.
What the fuck? Okay, so Jonathan's response here, and honestly his entire character, has become one of the most controversial parts of the movie. So let's analyze his dialogue here and try to understand his reasoning.
There's more at stake here than just our lives, Clark, or the lives of those around us. When the world finds out what you can do, it's going to change everything. You saw how Pete's mom reacted, right? She was scared of Clark.
Essentially, Jonathan is encouraging Clark to avoid using his powers because he's worried how people would react to his abilities. He knows how people would be intimidated and wants to protect Clark from the mental and possibly physical danger of that kind of backlash. But if his goal is to protect Clark's mental state, then scolding him for his decision to rescue the bus is bizarre considering what the alternative outcome would mean. If Clark didn't reveal his powers to rescue his classmates, he would have been the only child to survive the accident and had to live with the guilt of letting them die while dealing with the resentment of all their parents. That's a lot for a kid to grow up with. Pete's mum and her concerns seem pretty easily brushed aside, and we don't see any consequences for Clark's rescue outside of her confrontation. So with the choice between let 30 innocent children die and live with the regret versus become the centre of town gossip for a week, I'd say Clark made the right call, and it's bizarre to see Jonathan scold him for it. But the more important issue of Jonathan Kent's dialogue is how his advice is used to set up Clark's internal conflict. As this film has already established, Clark has struggled with the consequences of his powers growing up and wants to use his abilities to help people. So by contrasting Clark saving the bus with his father's warnings, these scenes combine to introduce a protagonist's internal conflict, that Clark using his powers to help people could create serious consequences for him. But the issue here is that the only challenges Clark actually faces for helping people are the disapproving lectures of his father. We never actually see Clark facing consequences for his decisions. There's no scene where his classmates don't interact with him out of fear, or their parents tell them to stay away from him, or even investigation from law enforcement. Instead, it's just Clark dealing with his father's nagging that revealing his powers would be worse than letting innocent children die. Man, what is it with Clark's father figures and advocating manslaughter? This is such a bizarre trend. So this isn't a great foundation for Clark's internal conflict, but unfortunately things only get worse as the film develops, so let's go on with the montage. The last thing this scene shows us is Jonathan revealing the ship Clark arrived on and explaining his alien origin when his son asks where he came from, which gives us this touching performance and their most heartwarming interaction in the movie.
Can I just keep pretending I'm your son?
You are my son.
I only wish the rest of their scenes were like this. The next scene cuts to Clark working anonymously at a bar where he overhears two soldiers discussing an alien crash site. Before a trucker sexually assaults a waitress and he intervenes to help her. At first it seems like this scene is developing the internal conflict introduced previously, with Clark wanting to stand up for people in trouble but not wanting to reveal his true powers or expose himself. But then after the trucker pours his drink over him and then hits him with the bottle, he goes outside and does this to their truck. What? Okay, I know a lot of Superman fans were upset with the way this scene characterizes him as a bitter arsehole who's afraid of public confrontation, but the bigger issue here is how the fuck did he manage this without anyone noticing? Again, Clark is supposed to be avoiding people discovering his powers, so why did he make such an obvious showcase of them, and how did nobody notice him smashing logs through this truck? Did no one in the bar hear what he was doing or come out and see him destroying this vehicle? Or did he pull it somewhere else to do this and no one saw or heard him drag it back? Because that's still going to make a lot of noise. Either way, Clark is doing a terrible job at hiding his abilities, which really contradicts how much importance the earlier scene placed on keeping his powers a secret. Like, you'd think he'd just drag the guy outside by the collar or whatever instead of doing all this. It bears repeating that once again, there isn't a lot of relevance between this scene and the previous flashback. But what's bizarre is that there's actually a flashback scene with more significance to this section which appears after the montage is finished. Just before he confronts Zod, Clark remembers an encounter with his childhood bullies where he restrained himself from using his super strength to avoid hurting them, just like his conflict with a trucker. It's completely out of place given the context, and it genuinely seems like somebody made an editing mistake and they just left it in the movie. Anyway, the scene ends as we see Clark hitchhiking to the crash site those soldiers mentioned, hoping to learn more about his alien heritage. And we transition to the next section. Also, just to recap the plot here, Clark's job on a random fishing boat got him caught up in rescuing some oil workers, after which he washed ashore and took up a job in the one town at the one bar where some random soldiers just happened to be talking about an alien crash site. That is some insane coincidence, but whatever. We next see Clark working as a luggage carrier at the military camp the US government set up outside the crash site, where he helps a certain reporter with her equipment before sneaking out at night to go to the spaceship. This is also the scene that introduces Lois Lane, but I'll save her analysis for later since we're focusing on Clark for now. When he laces aboard the spaceship, Clark has a hostile encounter with a ship's security drones before inserting the USB token Jor-El gave him. This makes the robots ignore him while summoning a mysterious hologram of Jor-El who quietly walks out of sight. I don't know why he's being so dramatic, like, just go talk to your son, dude. Clark follows after him but overhears Lois getting attacked by the security drones, and comes to her rescue, crushing the robot with his bare hands before tending to her injury, saying,
"I can do things that other people can't."
Which is one hell of an understatement. I hope Clark has cauterized a wound with his lasers before because that could have gone really badly. Anyway, the spaceship takes off and flies Clark away to a remote island before the hologram of Jor-El finally faces him. Lois isn't with him anymore, so we can only guess Clark just dumped her outside before the ship left. This is where we get that exposition between him and Clark that we discussed earlier, but the more important takeaway for Clark's character in this scene are his interactions with Lois. We know from the previous scenes that Clark is supposed to be following his parents' warnings to hide his powers, and has been trying to uncover the mystery behind his alien origins. But this scene shows him publicly displaying his powers to save Lois while ignoring potential information about his heritage, showing how he cares more about helping people than his alien ancestry or his parents' advice, which is actually consistent with what we've seen earlier. Remember how the first time we saw Clark, he very publicly displayed his powers to rescue a group of workers from an exploding oil rig. And in this scene, he has no hesitation saving Lois, someone he knows is a reporter from their earlier encounter, despite the potential consequences he was warned about. There's a clear disconnect here between what Clark's dad says he should do versus what Clark actually wants to do and how we see him behave, which is directly addressed in the later scene where Lois confronts him about it by tracking him down through the people he's rescued.
I figured if I turned over enough stones, you'd eventually find me.
This exchange is essential to understand Clark's character writing because their conversation highlights the main contradiction in his behavior across all the scenes of the montage. Lois points out that Clark's attempts to stay hidden will inevitably conflict with his desire to help people.
The only way you could disappear for good is to stop helping people altogether, and I sense that's not an option for you.
Which prompts Clark to explain his reasoning by telling her about his father. After which the film transitions to a flashback where we learn about the death of John Kent. Alright, the scene where Jonathan dies is simultaneously one of the most controversial parts of the movie while also being the most important scene to understand Clark's character. So let's start with some context. Now, the death of Clark's father is an event that has been retold, retconned and paraphrased countless times across Superman's continuity and adaptations. But despite all the different variants across the decades, there are some details which have been reused unchanged for their thematic significance. Notably, Jonathan's most common cause of death is typically a heart attack or some other terminal illness rather than the physical danger of some grand spectacle. Which is significant because it means that Jonathan's death is something that Clark, despite his abilities, doesn't have the power to change, which helps humanize him for the audience. As Clark directly states in the 1978 film adaptation,
"All those things I can do, all those powers, and I couldn't even save him."
The death of Clark's father helps make his character relatable to us despite his incredible powers and abilities. But more importantly, Jonathan's death serves as an essential part of his motivation as Superman. Because thematically, by showing Clark there are some things his powers just can't do, it inspires him to do everything he can do to improve the lives of those around him. It's classic superhero motivation. Man of Steel takes a different approach. The flashback opens with another argument between teenage Clark and his father about what he should do with his powers the rest of his life.
I just want to do something useful with my life. So farming, feeding people, that's not useful. I didn't say that.
It's clear the scene is intended to build on their conflict after the school bus incident, but their conversation is interrupted when an oncoming tornado forces everyone on the road to evacuate to safety. While escorting people to an overpass, Martha realizes they left the family dog behind and Clark offers to fetch it before his dad stops him, tells him to get people to shelter and goes back himself. It's clear he's trying to stop Clark from revealing his powers, but while rescuing the dog, Jonathan's leg is injured and caught under a fallen car, making him unable to escape the tornado. Clark sees his father about to die, but before he can go out to rescue him, Jonathan raises his hand telling him to stop, accepting his death while protecting his son. Right. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's start with the basics. Mechanically, the setup here is incredibly contrived. None of the characters behave realistically given the situation, and their reactions are clearly intended just to set up problems for the main cast. Like, when they see the tornado coming, all of these people decide to get out of their cars for some reason instead of just making a U-turn and driving away. They also decide to shelter under the overpass, which the National Weather Service describes as one of the worst possible shelter spaces, and I feel like people who live in Kansas should know this, but the scriptwriters didn't do their research.
Go for the overpass!
Man, this guy just keeps giving terrible advice, huh? But by far the biggest problem with this scene is that the protagonist's decisions are completely inconsistent with their values. Because while it makes sense for Jonathan to sacrifice himself to protect his son's identity from the world, there's absolutely no reason why Clark wouldn't try to save his dad. The film's attempted justification for this is stated after the flashback when Clark explains to Lois,
"I let my father die because I trusted him. Because he was convinced that I had to wait. That the world was not ready."
But that doesn't make any sense since, as we've seen throughout this montage, Clark has zero issue exposing his powers to help people, and close family members should be no exception. He saves his schoolmates from drowning before his father's lecture, and we know he goes on to save Lois and the oil workers during his adulthood despite knowing the risks. Hell, he wouldn't even need his powers to save Jonathan. A normal guy with his build could just run over and carry him back no problem. So given how the scene opens on Clark actively disagreeing with his father's advice, there's no reason he should be following it now just to watch Jonathan die. Because not only is it a completely unrealistic decision that almost no actual person would ever make, but it completely contradicts his existing characterization and everything the audience understands about his values. Seriously, why show your powers to help kids, hide them to let your dad die, then show them later to save oil riggers? This is just nonsense. Ultimately, instead of Jonathan's death being a humanizing moment that inspires Clark to use his powers for good, his sacrifice in Man of Steel arguably dehumanizes Clark by making him act out of character just to watch his father die. But the scene only gets worse when you realize how Jonathan's death recontextualizes Clark's behavior across the montage. Remember how throughout the present day scenes, Clark has been living anonymously, just drifting from place to place. And every time he uses his powers, he's always abandoned his current job and gone somewhere else. It's clear from this pattern of behavior that Jonathan's warnings are still affecting him, but as Lois highlights during their conversation,
the only way you could disappear for good is to stop helping people altogether, and I sense that's not an option for you.
As we've seen through the montage, Clark clearly wants to help people. He wants to use his powers to save lives and make the world a better place, but he's been staying anonymous out of respect for his parents' wishes and fear of the consequences they warned about. One could easily interpret his motivation to stay anonymous as guilt for his father's death by trying to honor his final wishes. And while you could argue this was never Jonathan's intention, that doesn't change the effect we've seen his advice have on Clark across the montage. Meaning that the scriptwriters effectively placed Clark's desire to do good in opposition to his upbringing from his parents, which is one hell of a departure from the character's mythos. In previous adaptations, Pa Kent's advice to his son is typically shown as the backbone of Superman's moral compass that drives his actions moving forward. In Man of Steel, John Kent's parenting is more like a trauma Clark has to recover from to become the person he always wanted to be. No wonder fans were pissed. How do you fuck this up? Now, this internal conflict could still technically work if these ideas were further explored through the story and John's advice clearly informed Clark's behavior across the movie. But as we'll soon discuss, this film has other priorities. This is the part of the story where Zod arrives on Earth, so now seems like the perfect time to talk about this movie's central antagonist. Now, during the last two sections, we analysed Clark and Jor-El's character rising by breaking down their actions to determine their values and motivations. But unlike either of those characters, Zod's values and motivations are explicitly spelled out for us in his monologue before fighting Clark in the finale.
I exist only to protect Krypton. That is the sole purpose for which I was born. And every action I take, no matter how violent or how cruel, is for the greater good of my people.
Great dialogue here, guys, really subtle. So for Zod's analysis, instead of trying to decipher his character by chronologically breaking down his actions, I want to try the opposite approach, and test whether his actions are consistent with his stated character. Let's get started. Zod is first introduced in the opening sequence where he interrupts Jor-El's meeting with the Council by staging a military coup to take over the planet. When Jor-El asks what he's doing, Zod responds,
What I should have done years ago. These lawmakers, with their endless debates, have led Krypton to ruin.
And this explanation seems to make perfect sense for his character. As he directly stated for the audience, Zod defines himself and his ambitions by the societal role he was genetically engineered for. This makes him a narrative foil for Clark, who was conceived without a specific role and has spent the majority of the first act trying to find the meaning behind his origins and powers. It's the classic nature versus nurture dynamic. He was bred to be a soldier and has dedicated his life to advancing the Kryptonian society that created him. So it makes sense that he would use his military prowess to overthrow the people leading his society into destruction. Honestly, this almost seems reasonable given how dangerously stupid we know the Council is. Until Zod invites Jor-El to join him ruling the planet so they can
sever the degenerative bloodlines that led us to this state.
Right. I'm not exactly sure what bloodline even means in the context of a genetically engineered society, but given the word's historical allusion to real-world military groups with a hatred of inferior genetics, it's pretty clear this line was only really included to characterize Zod as a bad guy. Dude is a space fascist, and the writers want the audience to know it. Zod's loyalty to Krypton and pride in his genetics also explains why he attacks Jor-El after he steals the codex to launch it into space with his son. Still have no idea why he did that. Again, Zod considers his genetic engineering to be an integral part of his identity as well as the society he's fighting for. So Jor-El stealing the codex that facilitates Kryptonian gene editing represents a direct attack to the idea of Krypton he devoted his life to. Although, from what the film shows us, it doesn't seem like Krypton's genetic engineering is really even that effective. Like, Zod was supposed to be good at fighting, right? He even brags during his fight with Clark how he was
Bred to be a warrior, Cal. Trained my entire life to master my senses.
But the first time we actually see him in combat, he completely loses to Jor-El in a fist fight. He doesn't even remember to use this hidden knife he's got until it's too late. Also remember, Krypton's council was apparently bred specifically to properly govern their society, but instead they destroyed their own planet's core via energy mining, then refused to evacuate anyone because they gave up on space travel for no reason. Furthermore, Jor-El was supposedly engineered to be a great scientist, but from what we saw from his plan in the earlier segment, it seems like he has a better understanding of kickboxing than scientific theory. So even though their society genetically engineers Kryptonians for their specialized roles, none of the Kryptonians the film shows us are any good at the job they're designed for. But hey, we already knew this movie had world-building problems, this is nothing new. But regardless of his performance, Zod's actual behavior in the prologue still lines up with his asserted character traits. So while it's hard to take him seriously as a threat after getting thoroughly beaten by Jor-El in this embarrassing line delivery,
I will find him!
all his decisions so far are still technically consistent with his stated values and motivations. Anyway, the scene ends with Zod declaring his intention to find Clark and recover the codex to restart Krypton civilization, which is the last time the audience sees him until he arrives on Earth after escaping the Phantom Zone, and well, this is where the problems start. When Zod arrives on Earth, he announces his arrival by causing a worldwide blackout and broadcasting a creepy message through Earth's communication technology.
My name is General Zod. I come from a world far from yours. For some time, your world has sheltered one of my citizens. I request that you return this individual to my custody. For reasons unknown, he has chosen to keep his existence a secret from you. He will have made efforts to blend in. He will look like you, but he is not one of you. To those of you who may know of his current location, the fate of your planet rests in your hands. To Kal-El, I say that surrender within 24 hours, or watch this world suffer the consequences.
Let's break down all the implications of this. Now, obviously Zod would want to find Clark since he's the only person who would know the location of the codex. Although from a tactical perspective, it's a little optimistic to assume the people of Earth will be able to locate an identical looking alien in the space of 24 hours. Might want to postpone the deadline a little bit. But the more important detail in Zod's speech is how he makes the assumption that Clark has been living anonymously but would give himself up for Earth's protection. Even though he's never seen or interacted with Clark, Zod's entire plan to retrieve a codex relies on the assumption that Clark has been hiding his alien identity but cares enough about helping people to expose himself for the safety of humanity. Now, we the audience know this is true, but Zod only got here a few minutes ago. For all he knows, Clark could be locked away in some government test site like Jonathan warned about, or that he might abandon Earth in the same ship he arrived in to escape. But instead, Zod just knows what's going on like he read the script or something. Furthermore, by blackmailing Clark and holding everyone on the planet hostage, Zod has put himself in an adversarial position with the one person he desperately needs information from. This really isn't a great start for negotiations, which is weird coming from a character supposedly bred for military strategy, but it gets even more confusing when Clark arrives on Zod's ship and he behaves completely differently from how he came across in the broadcast. Just a few hours ago, Zod was threatening to wipe out humanity unless Clark revealed himself, but when they actually meet, he starts giving him a friendly history lesson and invites him to join their cause. What gives? But what makes this switch up even more confusing is that Clark doesn't have any discernible reaction to Zod's change in attitude, even though he just saw him threaten the safety of the planet and knows he's bad news from his father's exposition earlier. Instead, the actual context of their meeting is never acknowledged, and it seems like neither the characters or the scriptwriters even remember Zod's speech even happened. Which makes the big reveal in his history lesson even more awkward. When Clark arrives on Zod's ship, he quickly loses consciousness as the Kryptonian atmosphere takes away his strength, after which Zod has him hooked up to some kind of mind reader device and explains how he escaped the Phantom Zone while showing his plans for the future. Zod explains how the destruction of Krypton freed him and his allies from the Phantom Zone for some reason, and that they spent the next 33 years salvaging old Kryptonian outposts for technology and resources. Zod then reveals that the distress beacon Clark accidentally activated on the crashed Kryptonian ship was what summoned him to Earth, and that Clark has the information he needs to complete his ultimate plan to restart Krypton.
On Krypton, the genetic template for every being yet to be born is encoded in the Registry of Citizens. Your father stole the registry's codex and stored it in the capsule that brought you here.
For what purpose?
So that Krypton can live again on Earth.
But Clark understandably asks,
Krypton lives again. What happens to Earth?
And well, this is how Zod responds.
The foundation has to be built on something. Even your father recognized that.
What the fuck? Just to be clear, Zod needs Clark's information to help him conquer the planet, and this was the visual he chose to try and convince him? How is burying Clark alive in the skulls of his loved ones supposed to make him more sympathetic to your cause? What the hell made him think this would work? Again, Zod knows Clark cares about humanity and would do anything to protect them. Just a few scenes earlier, he blackmailed Clark into revealing himself by demanding that he surrender or watch this planet suffer the consequences. So how did he expect Clark to respond to this? Now, you could argue Zod didn't need Clark's cooperation to find a codex since he has access to his memories via some kind of mental manipulation technology. But if that's the case, why did he bother conversing with Clark in the first place? And what's the point of his lecture? Just read his mind and get this over with. Also, this twist villain reveal scene really doesn't work with the context of Zod's broadcast, since why is Clark surprised that the guy who threatened to wipe out humanity wants to wipe out humanity? Like, dude, I don't know what you were expecting. This whole exchange just reminds me of a much better scene from a much better movie, which is the perfect excuse to talk about a good superhero film for a change. In the second act of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, the film sets up a very similar situation between the film's protagonist Peter and his father, the main villain, Ego the Living Planet. The dynamic here is pretty similar. Ego has Peter under some kind of mental manipulation and is explaining his plan for galactic domination and why he needs Peter's help. But it's the key differences here that completely change the execution. Firstly, Ego has been building his influence over Peter across the movie, and the scene clearly shows us that he has him under some kind of brainwashing, visualized by his clouded eyes. This makes it more reasonable for Ego to assume Peter will be amicable to his plan since he's literally influencing his mental state. But the more important difference is that the dialogue between them is logically consistent with their character and motivations. Ego is surprisingly similar to Zod to the extent they are both motivated to fulfill what they perceive as their life's purpose. Except instead of protecting the future of Krypton, in Ego's case it's expanding himself across the whole galaxy.
I call it the expansion. It is my purpose. And now, it is yours as well. I need to fulfill life's one true purpose. To grow and spread, covering all that exists until everything is me.
Ego's motivations are pretty easily understandable. His origin as the universe's only living planet have made him frustrated with the state of life in the galaxy since nothing else in the universe is powerful enough for him to relate to. So since nothing in the universe is really like him, he plans to make everything just like him. No better company than yourself. To this extent, he's implanted fragments of himself into every planet in the galaxy and plans to completely absorb them. Now he just needs Peter's power to finish the job.
I only had one problem. A single Celestial doesn't have enough power for such an enterprise. But two Celestials, well now, that just might do. For the first time in my existence, I am truly not alone!
This last line is important because it highlights the fundamental vulnerability behind Ego's motivation. Remember, Ego has spent his whole lifetime feeling unable to connect with anybody because his overwhelming power and, well, ego, means he views everyone else in the galaxy beneath him. So now that he's finally made another Celestial, it makes sense he would actually want to tell Peter his plan since this is the first time he's had a genuine conversation with somebody he sees on the same level. There's just one issue.
What is it, son?
My friends.
Even through Ego's brainwashing, Peter slowly realizes how the expansion would put all of his friends in danger. So Ego tries to console him.
Well, you see, that's the mortal in you, Peter. We are beyond such things.
But Peter, despite his mental state, realizes the obvious contradiction with what Ego has told him.
Now.
But my mother. You said you loved my mother.
Peter recognizes the discrepancy between Ego saying their relationships with mortals don't matter and his earlier claims to have loved Peter's mother. And Ego, believing he's fulfilled his goal and has someone who could relate to him, reveals what he considers to be his greatest sacrifice in a rare moment of vulnerability.
And that I did. My river lily, who knew all the words to every song that came over the radio. I returned to Earth to see her 3 times. And I knew if I returned a 4th, I'd never leave. The expansion, reason for my very existence would be over, so I did what I had to do. But it broke my heart to put that tumor in her head.
This dramatic reveal establishes Ego as a central antagonist of the movie, but unlike Man of Steel, the twist works because the conversation it emerges from is completely consistent with its characters' personalities and motivations. Since Ego is ultimately driven by loneliness and his desire for connection, his decision to share his plans and regrets with Peter makes sense because this kind of conversation is what he's been looking for his entire life. Again, he doesn't try convincing Peter to help him by burying him alive in a pile of human skulls. He confesses his guilt to the first person in his life he could meaningfully connect with while having them under mind control. But this conversation destroys Ego's influence over Peter, which also makes sense since he just admitted responsibility for the most traumatic event in Peter's life. And Peter's reaction is... pretty reasonable. Anyway, back to Man of Steel. So now we've already established that Zod has basically zero negotiating skills, let's examine his plan to restart Krypton and how he actually intends to achieve this. Because despite supposedly being engineered as an expert military general, Zod's actual tactical decisions are kinda stupid. After the human skull burial tactic doesn't work out, one of Zod's scientists eventually discovers that Jor-El stored the Codex data in his son's DNA, for whatever reason. So Zod knows he needs to either capture Clark or kill him to get the Codex back. but he also knows Clark's superpowers are strong enough to destroy Kryptonian technology and overpower his soldiers. So Zod's plan to take out Clark and restart Krypton is to send a giant terraforming machine to Earth to wipe out the planet while turning the environment into Krypton. Now, in theory, this will achieve his goals of remaking Krypton by building a perfect copy of a planet's environment, while also defeating Clark by taking away his powers of exposure to Krypton's environment. But when you think about everything Zod has just learned from his interactions with Clark, this plan has a pretty obvious issue. Remember, Zod knows Clark cares about humanity and wants to protect them, and he also knows Clark is powerful enough to destroy Kryptonian technology. So if Zod sends a terraforming machine to Earth, Clark could just destroy it and ruin his chances to restart Krypton, which, unsurprisingly, is exactly what happens in the rest of the movie. Ignoring Zod's plan for just a second, the Kryptonians had a terraforming machine? You're telling me the Kryptonians had the technology to turn any planet into a world they could live on and none of them decided to use it when their homeworld was blowing up?
There are habitable worlds within reach.
Buddy, every world can be habitable for you guys. Was everyone on Krypton suicidal or something? Anyway, besides this stupid plan being a pretty contrived excuse to raise the stakes for the finale, the real issue with Zod's decision here is how it affects his characterization while contradicting his stated personality traits and values. Because despite the film telling us that Zod is a born military expert with a deep desire to restore his planet, his strategy here destroys his only chance to restart Krypton while ignoring the obvious alternative. Why not just get superpowers yourselves? Seriously, Zod already knows that exposure to Earth's atmosphere gives Kryptonian superpowers, so if they wanted an easy way to defeat Clark, then why don't they just get the same powers he has then gang up to take him down? They wouldn't even need to risk visiting the planet since we know Zod's ship can simulate different air conditions, so they could just charge up for a while then fly down to retrieve a codex. But Zod and his team never even discussed this idea despite the plan having no visible downsides and their current strategy risking valuable resources and potentially ruining their chances to remake Krypton. The only explanation the film ever gives us for why Zod might be against this plan comes from his conversation with Jor-El's hologram, where Zod dismisses the idea they could live alongside humans by asking,
"So we can suffer through years of pain trying to adapt like your son has?"
Years of pain? Zod, it's like 2 minutes. Zod knows it wouldn't take long for his crew to adjust to Earth's atmosphere. He just saw how quickly Clark adapted to the Kryptonian air on his ship. 5 minutes of breathing difficulty in exchange for invincible superpowers, and instead he risks his last chance to save Krypton by pissing off the one guy who could tear through his ship like Play-Doh. Is he stupid? Well, honestly, yeah, he is. When you try and rationalize a consistent reason for every decision Zod makes in the plot of this movie, the only explanation that really makes sense is that Zod's just kind of an idiot. Despite the scriptwriter's attempts to characterize him by just blatantly stating his character traits before the film's climax, his actual screen time only makes him look like a clueless loser.
I was bred to be a warrior, Cap. Trained my entire life to master my senses. Where did you train? On a fuck?
Again, he's supposed to be trained as a warrior, but he loses his only 2 fights to a scientist and a farm boy. He's supposed to be engineered as a general, but he has 0 negotiating skills, and his ultimate strategy just destroys all of his resources while getting all of his men killed. He's supposed to care about Krypton, but he's so incompetent that if he didn't keep bringing it up every 3 minutes, then it'd be impossible to tell what he's trying to accomplish or why. Again, I understand what the scriptwriters were going for. They made it pretty fucking obvious. But just like Jor-El, the problem is that whatever characterization the scriptwriters intended is completely different from the characterization we actually get. Because despite what this exposition tries to tell us about his character, what his decisions and actions show us gives the audience a completely different impression about what Zod's character actually is. And again, Zod's not the only example. So far, this analysis has primarily focused on Man of Steel's approach to its setting and characterizing, but I want to switch focus to a more controversial aspect, the action. Back when the film first released, one of the most common complaints from audiences was the movie's approach to its fight scenes and the sheer level of destruction caused by the characters. Some fans believe that this type of violence was inappropriate for a Superman movie, while many critics specifically disparaged the film for its gratuitous destruction and violence. And well, it's easy to see why. Zack Snyder even addressed this backlash in his 2014 interview with Forbes, saying, "The thing I was surprised about in response to Superman was how everyone clings to the Christopher Reeves version. It's just funny to see people taking it personally because I made him real, you know?" Realistically portraying the inevitable destruction of superhero fight scenes was actually one of the filmmaker's main priorities. According to Snyder, "We really wanted to show it wasn't just like the PG-13 version where everyone just gets up and they're fine. I really wanted to show the violence is real. People get killed or get hurt and it's not fun or funny." But the problem with Man of Steel's action scenes wasn't that the amount of collateral damage was unrealistic for superhero fights. The problem was that Man of Steel's fight scenes completely disregard its established characters and plot lines, and that most of this destruction is somehow Superman's fault. Let me explain. See, fight scenes by definition ultimately represent a conflict between the opposing values of two characters. These scenes only make sense if you have two characters with strongly established conflicting motivations which will drive them to actually fight each other. So it follows that the character's behaviour during the fight scenes should be consistent with the personal values and priorities that started the fight in the first place. This makes fight scenes a fantastic opportunity for characterization since you can develop their values through their actions during the fight. But the problem with Man of Steel's action scenes is that the protagonist's behaviour completely contradicts their established characterization and makes all of the violence and destruction feel pointless. Just look at the first fight scene between Clark and Zod. Now for context, this fight takes place after their meeting on Zod's ship, when Zod goes to Clark's childhood home to search for the Codex while Clark has just escaped the ship and rescued Lois. When Zod arrives, he threatens Clark's mum Martha to interrogate her for the location of the Codex, and when Clark hears that she is in danger, he immediately flies over to rescue her. Quick side note, but I like the detail where Clark knows his mum is in danger because he hears her being threatened with his super senses. I wonder if that will ever come up again. Anyway, Zod destroys the farmhouse after he discovers Martha doesn't have a codex just as Clark swoops down to save her, and this is where the problems start. Okay, this is already stupid. Instead of grabbing his mum and flying her to safety, Clark rams himself into Zod, then flies him through a nearby grain silo before dragging him through a nearby cornfield. Remember that Clark's main concern here was to rescue his mum from danger, but now he's left her behind with two of Zod's henchmen. For all Clark knows, there's no reason they wouldn't just kill her, or take her with them as a hostage, or even mentally torture her for more information. Which means that by leaving her behind to go and fight Zod, Clark has apparently forgotten the whole reason he was even here in the first place. This is a problem because there's a clear disconnect between what the characters' motives are versus what they actually decide to do. But this issue is about to get so much worse as Clark keeps dragging Zod through the cornfield until... Okay, let's unpack this. To recap, Clark's whole character arc throughout this movie has been the internal conflict between his desire to help people using his powers versus the fear of potential backlash against him. We've seen him publicly use his powers multiple times to rescue innocent people in danger, but he always flees the scene afterwards following his dad's warnings of how people could react to his abilities. So if there are two things we know Clark should care about in any situation, it should be protecting people from danger and how people react to his superpowers. But the fight scene in Smallville shows Clark completely ignoring the people around them and destroys his characterization in what seems like a cheap excuse to see buildings explode. When they first arrive, Clark and Zod smash right through a petrol station which explodes right behind them. But instead of showing any concern for the people who died in that accident, Clark just taunts Zod for struggling to adapt to Earth's atmosphere.
What have you done to me?
My parents taught me to hone my senses, Zod. Focus on just what I wanted to see. Without your helmet, you're getting everything. And it hurts, doesn't it?
This is such a weird moment because the film's sound design highlights the screaming civilians through the background noise, but Clark just mocks Zod for being disoriented by the sound instead of actually helping the people in danger. Like, we know Clark can hear them screaming because of his super senses, but he never reacts with any concern for their safety or to try to help the people his actions put in life-threatening danger. Which completely undermines his characterization during the first half of the film by showing Clark to be uninterested in saving lives and dismissing the consequences of using his powers. This only gets worse when Zod's crew arrive to evacuate him while his top grunts stay behind to fight, because despite knowing the chaos their fight will cause, Clark never makes an attempt to incapacitate them or take the fight away from the people of Smallville. Like, Clark just saw how easily Zod got taken out when his helmet was damaged, exposing him to Earth's atmosphere, so he knows a Kryptonian's weakness, and unlike his opponents, he has the power to fly, so he could easily drag them away from the population. But despite having plenty of opportunities to protect the innocent people around him, Clark never tries to prevent any collateral damage and seems completely unconcerned that the people around him will suffer. When Zod's grunts first confront him, Clark just walks slowly towards them in a standoff instead of leaving the town to take the fight away from civilians. I mean, he knows these guys want to fight him and he's seen how dangerous this could be for the people around him, but he chooses to just fight in the middle of a street instead of trying to lead them outside of Smallville. He eventually drags this guy up into the air, but instead of tossing him into space or something, he throws him straight at a petrol-carrying freight train. This is Kansas. He could have thrown him almost anywhere without hurting anyone, but he managed to pick the one spot where people are most likely to die from the collateral explosion. When the US military arrives to attack them, Clark grabs this lady from midair to stop her from killing the fighter jet pilot. He's holding on to her so he could fly her wherever he wants out of harm's way and avoid the mistake he made at the start of the fight. Instead, he crashes her straight into the local IHOP because I guess all of his special effects needed some funding from product placement. Man, lucky they landed in one of the empty booths. This is where we get some actual characterization for Zod's commander lady, and I want to take a quick break to look at what she says because this film's dialogue is truly awful.
You are weak, son of Hell. Unsure of yourself. The fact that you possess a sense of morality, and we do not, gives us an evolutionary advantage. And if history has proven anything, it is that evolution always wins.
Fucking hell. You have morals and are weak. We have no morals and am strong. We are the bad guys. I would say this sounds like a speech from a Saturday morning cartoon villain, but that would be unfair because the dialogue in Superman the Animated Series is so much better than this.
I'm afraid we already have a window washer.
But ignoring how cartoonishly evil she is, evolution always wins? Lady, your people invented genetic engineering. You literally defeated evolution. The lead scriptwriter David S. Goyer mentioned during an interview how he first started the script during the production of The Dark Knight Rises, and looking at some of these lines, I'm starting to wonder if they ever moved on from that first draft. Anyway, the point is that despite his previous characterization, Clark really doesn't seem to care about helping people and doesn't seem to realize the danger he's causing at all. The only times he actually goes out of his way to save people are when he stops this lady from killing this jet pilot and when he catches this dude from falling to death. Although with the speed he was flying at, there's no way this guy's spine didn't break the second they made contact. Oh well, movie logic I guess.
He's fucking dead.
You might have noticed how the only people Clark seems to care about saving in this fight are members of the US Army. And I just want you to keep this particular trend in mind since it's going to be relevant later. When you compare the film's lack of focus on any human consequences of this fight to the amount of footage specifically dedicated to showing mass destruction, it's pretty clear the filmmakers didn't really care about the character implications of this fight and were only interested in showing buildings blow up. Which makes sense for an action blockbuster to focus on the spectacle of digital effects, but these goals really shouldn't be exclusive and there's plenty of superhero films that manage both priorities. For example, in the second act of Spider-Man Homecoming, Spider-Man confronts the supervillain Vulture during a high-tech weapons deal on a ferry, causing a fight scene that escalates until a weapons malfunction slices the whole boat in half. When he realizes how his mistakes have put innocent people in danger, Spidey's priorities immediately shift from catching the Vulture to rescuing people by using his webbing to try and repair the ship. It's a great action scene because it shows off a superhero's unique abilities while clearly demonstrating the character's values through their actions. And tension is still generated by his attempts to keep innocent people safe. But in the fight scene from Man of Steel, Clark never acknowledges the people around him are in danger, let alone try to protect them outside of those two military guys, and this one line of dialogue before his fight with Zod's goons.
Get inside. It's not safe.
Which, compared to his reckless behavior during that, hey wait a second.
Get inside. It's not safe. Get inside. Get inside. Get inside. Get inside.
That line was ADR. It says so much about the priorities of the filmmakers that the only example of Superman caring about the lives of everyday people had to be edited in during post-production. This is already pretty terrible characterization for a Superman movie given the character's whole premise is supposed to be a superpowered hero who saves people, but it also completely ignores the internal conflict set up earlier in the movie. Earlier, Clark's dad warned him that if he ever revealed his powers to the world, then humanity would be scared and may eventually hate him. Now Clark has used his powers in a very public showdown and hundreds of people died. This should be a serious low point of Clark's character arc because not only has he failed to protect people, but everything his dad warned about is coming true thanks to his actions. Except there's no scene where Clark ever acknowledges the consequences of his actions or shows any visible reaction to all the destruction. When the fight ends, the only scene that addresses the aftermath shows a confrontation between Clark and the soldiers, where the acting commander acknowledges Clark as an ally against the Kryptonians, saying,
"This man is not our enemy."
Which is bizarre because why does the film spend more time showing Clark's interactions with the army instead of developing the internal conflict they established earlier? It just seems like the filmmakers were less interested in exploring Clark's character than they were in establishing his positive relationship with the US military. Which turns out to be true because, as we soon discover, this focus is actually set up for the scene that happens almost immediately after. As mentioned earlier, after the disaster in Smallville is over, Zod discovers the Codex was stored inside Clark's body and sends a world engine to terraform Earth and kill Superman. The way this machine works is by traveling to the other side of a planet, then linking with Zod's ship to shoot some kind of laser through the center of the Earth. This causes massive gravitational shockwaves, with one machine starting in the Indian Ocean while the other starts destroying an American city because, well, this is a Hollywood blockbuster. After the characters all realize what's happening, Clark meets up with the US Army to explain the plan Jor-El told Lois for how to defeat the Kryptonians. This plan requires Clark and the army to work together so Clark can destroy the machine in the ocean while the military take out the one in Metropolis. Which might sound reasonable at first, but when you consider the key assumptions the whole plan is based on, there's a major oversight here which seriously damages the film's characterization. See, the entire premise of this plan relies on Clark being strong enough to take out a world engine despite the presence of Kryptonian atmosphere, something the characters in-universe point out is a risk.
If that thing is making Earth more like Krypton, won't you be weaker around it?
Maybe.
If only they had another superpowered alien from a different planet who could help out. One who'd be immune to Kryptonian terraforming and was clearly interested in protecting the planet. Oh well. But if Clark believes he'll be able to take out a world engine, which is reasonable to assume since he could destroy them at a distance with his lasers, then why doesn't he just go destroy the one in Metropolis, and why doesn't he do it right now? Just to recap the situation, there are currently 2 alien spaceships terraforming Earth, one in Metropolis and one in the Indian Ocean. So why not just destroy the one in Metropolis? For all they know, the Kryptonian terraforming wouldn't work with just one world engine, otherwise why would they even use 2 spaceships to begin with? So destroying the one in Metropolis could stop the entire process. Even if it didn't, Clark could just fly over and destroy the other one later, after the Black Zero is gone and no one else is in danger. So why doesn't he? Because as the film shows us, for every second that world engine is on, hundreds of people are dying. Again, characterization emerges from their actions. The audience should be able to interpret their values and priorities from the decisions they make on screen. So what does Clark talking here, instead of helping here, say about Superman? After reading and listening to the production team's interviews where they discuss the film's character writing, it's clear they intended to characterize Clark as a heroic figure concerned with saving lives. But this intention is completely at odds with the content of the movie because if Superman was genuinely invested in helping people, then the second he found out an alien laser was destroying a city, he would fly over and stop it. Instead, he wastes time and potentially thousands of lives by flying to a military airbase to pitch them a plan to take out the machines he should already be stopping. What is this plan anyway?
This ship is powered by something called a phantom drive. It bends space. Zod's ship uses the same technology, and if we can make the 2 drives collide with one another,
A singularity can be created.
like a black hole.
A black hole. Jor-El's plan to take out the world engine is to create a black hole in the middle of Metropolis. Remember back in the earlier section on Krypton how I mentioned the writers for this film just throw in random sci-fi concepts without understanding their implications? This is the perfect example of that. It should go without saying how terrible this plan is, but to anyone still confused, here's a quick science lesson.
Of all the objects in space, this lethal mass possesses the strongest gravitational pull, earning its name. Because nothing, not even light, can escape the grasp of a black hole. Anything or anyone that crosses its outer edge, an invisible boundary known as the event horizon, will never be seen again.
As the Earth approaches the singularity, the black hole's gravity is stronger on one side of the Earth than the other. And so because of that difference in strength of gravity, there's a stretching and a squeezing effect that gets applied to the Earth.
With the Earth close to the singularity, buildings, bridges, and then the Earth's surface itself violently buckles.
When it's being ripped apart, those kind of geologic events, volcanoes, earthquakes, everything is going to be going off at once. The absolute, utter, concise destruction of the planet on a cosmological scale.
As the material that had been the Earth is drawn ever closer to the core of this black hole, what happens is the strength of gravity goes up so quickly that you can start to rip apart not just a planet into rubble, but you rip apart the rubble into dust, and then you rip apart the dust into molecules, the molecules into atoms, and then it's possible you even rip the atoms apart into subnuclear particles. After the supermassive black hole has passed through our portion of the Milky Way, where there once was our solar system, is only a cleared lane where not even interstellar dust remains.
Yeah, black holes are dangerous. Even a small one is powerful enough to destroy an entire star, and Jor-El's plan is to create one in Metropolis by smashing two spaceships together. So if anything goes wrong or the reaction doesn't turn out like they hoped, then this plan to save the Earth could destroy the whole solar system. This is a terrible plan.
General, that craft maxes out 17,000 pounds. We can drop it from a C-17. It's a viable plan.
I really don't think that's the main concern right now, dude. The fact that the scientist guy here even considers this is absurd. Because he should know it would be unironically safer to nuke Metropolis than to create a black hole that could wipe out the whole solar system. So not only does it make no sense for Clark to be talking here now instead of saving lives by destroying the world engine, but there's absolutely no reason for the American military to agree to this plan that could essentially destroy the planet. Well, unless you consider the meta. See, it's worth noting that there's also another more insidious reason why Clark and the army are teaming up to take out Zod's ship. Because as we alluded to earlier, this film is propaganda for the American military. Okay, I know that accusation gets thrown around a lot, but this isn't something stupid like Paw Patrol having a police dog character. I mean that this film was explicitly financed by the United States government to promote enlistment to its armed forces. US Major Greg Galligan specifically described the film and its associated advertising as the biggest campaign of its time we've ever done. So the main reason behind the black hole plan was because the scriptwriters needed a way for the army to be equal participants in saving the world alongside Superman. They needed to shoehorn the US military into a conflict Superman could easily resolve by himself. So they had Clark suggest a plan that could wipe out the solar system before flying to the other side of the globe instead of just having him save the day in Metropolis. Now, despite the official sponsorship, you might be tempted to argue this movie doesn't technically count as propaganda because the American military is portrayed as largely ineffective or incompetent while causing unnecessary damage. But as we've already been through, this movie portrays Superman as ineffective and incompetent while causing unnecessary damage, so that excuse doesn't really hold up. Instead, this movie goes out of its way to depict members of the US Army as fearless heroes in the face of alien invasion, while fighting alongside Superman to help save the day. The end result is a script that tears itself in half trying to contrive a reason for the American military to be equal participants in the battle to save the world, despite the plan itself being unbelievably dangerous and Superman's absence in Metropolis contributing to serious collateral damage. And I really can't overstate the level of destruction we're talking about here because holy shit, look at this. Hundreds of people probably died in this one shot. Zack Snyder is on record stating that 5,000 people died in the Black Zero incident, but when you compare what we see in the movie to the consequences of real-world disasters, that estimate is absurdly low. In Man of Steel, the Black Zero takes out like 20 buildings in its first 10 seconds on screen. Even if you assume there were less than 1,000 people in each, that's still over 20,000 people who died. more than 7 times the director's intention, and that's not even counting the people who died after Clark gets back. See, when Clark finally returns to Metropolis, he arrives just in time to save Lois and the Commander by flying into Zod's ship just before he can attack them. But just before he finishes the job, Zod begs him not to destroy the ship since it's carrying the last Genesis chamber and the only chance of restarting Kryptonian civilization.
Stop! If you destroy this ship, you destroy Krypton!
This is actually a pretty good moment because not only is it completely in character for Zod, but it's also a great opportunity to characterize Clark by exploring a new dynamic between his values. We know Clark wants to save people, and he spent the first half of this film trying to discover his alien heritage to find the reason he was sent to Earth in a pretty explicit search for meaning. So we know Clark wants to use his powers for good, and we also know he puts great importance on his alien origins. So this could be the perfect chance for him to use his powers to save the future of Krypton and humanity at once, just like Jor-El encouraged him to. Now that the world engine is destroyed and Zod is begging Clark to spare the Genesis chamber, Clark has a perfect opportunity to—
Krypton had its chance!
No. Clark instead lasers the ship in half while it's flying over the city, destroying the Genesis chamber and crashing the wreckage through 6 skyscrapers. What the fuck can you even say about this, man? At the start of this segment, I mentioned how one of the biggest issues critics and audiences had with this movie was its gratuitous depiction of collateral destruction. And when you look at scenes like this, it's easy to see why. Because the entire third act is just filled with scenes that completely disregard the protagonist's moral characterization for a cheap excuse to see buildings explode. Again, action scenes only make sense if a character's behavior is consistent with their established drives and motivations. And this film has spent a long time showing how much Clark cares about helping people in his alien heritage. But despite having the perfect situation to explore a new dynamic between its protagonist's values, the scriptwriters just ignored this narrative potential in favour of showing us skyscrapers collapse. And yet, when you listen to interviews with the film's creators, it seems like they genuinely had no idea why people would have a problem with this. In an interview with Bleeding Cool, David Goyer dismissed this backlash, stating, "When you're dealing with a threat like this, there will be collateral damage. This is something that hadn't been depicted in comic book films is what would it be like if a Hulk and Thor fought. People would probably die. Particularly in the case where Zod and the Kryptonians really don't care if people die. I think that upsets some people." Alright, not to be rude, but it's pretty clear he has no idea what he's talking about. A movie where the Hulk and Thor fought came out literally 1 year before Man of Steel did. And the whole point of that scene was Thor trying to stop Hulk from hurting people. But this comment misses the point of the criticism. People weren't angry because Man of Steel showed a bunch of collateral damage. Plenty of older movies feature much higher levels of destruction. People were angry because Man of Steel showed that Superman was responsible for a bunch of collateral damage, and the resulting deaths of thousands of people. Like, the reason anyone died from collateral damage in Smallville was because Superman dragged an alien warlord there, then had a fistfight with his underlings. The reason so many people died in Metropolis was because Superman was screwing around on the other side of the planet instead of stopping the machine actually putting people in danger. And the reason anyone died from his fight with Zod was because Superman didn't drag his enemy away from civilians and actually dragged him back to the city, putting people back in danger. Hell, even the black hole plan ended up getting people killed with all the jets that crashed into the city, which wouldn't have happened if Superman had just destroyed the machine in Metropolis. Instead, everyone in the air carrier had to put their lives in danger to take out the machine Clark should have already destroyed hours ago, which means all of these people had to risk their lives for nothing. Oh hey Lois, what the fuck are you doing here? Okay, before we get to the final part of this analysis, I want to take a quick minute to review how the film's scriptwriters handle the character of Lois Lane. Not to break down her characterization or development, but to examine her role in the story and how she contributes to Man of Steel's plot progression. Because it's genuinely fascinating how often she gets shoehorned into dangerous situations just to move the story forward. Let me show you what I mean. The first example of this happened shortly after her introduction at the military campsite, where she randomly steps out in the middle of the night to take a photo just as Clark happens to be climbing up the cliff face. She then somehow proceeds to scale a fucking glacier in weather conditions the local researchers describe as minus 40 degrees, before breaking into the spaceship and somehow surviving a lethal assault from the ship's security drones. Seriously, this really should have killed her. Now, while it's incredibly stupid that this newspaper reporter has the skills of an expert Arctic rock climber, at least the scene reinforces her character traits by showcasing her curiosity and how far she'll go for the truth. But this trend only gets worse later in the movie when Clark surrenders himself to the American government to hand himself over to Zod and protect Lois from being interrogated for his identity. After which Lois accompanies him to the meeting zone and this happens.
Are you the ranking officer here?
I am.
General Zod would like this woman to accompany me.
Why? No, seriously, the film never explains why Zod wants to kidnap this random journalist. The closest thing we ever get to an explanation comes after Clark saves her from the ship, where she describes how she
I didn't want to tell them anything about you, but they did something to me. They looked inside my mind.
which implies that they used their mind-reading tech to search her for information. But Lois wouldn't know anything more about the Codex than Clark would, though it's pretty clear that the only reason Zod takes her aboard his ship is because the scriptwriters needed her to be there for the next part of the plot to work. See, just before arriving aboard the ship, Clark gives Lois a Kryptonian memory drive Jor-El left in his capsule that he used to disable the crashed ship security systems. But I don't know what he expects her to do with it, because obviously they'd search her for tools or weapons, and there's no way they'd imprison her anywhere she could actually plug it in. Right. So the only reason Clark even escaped from Zod's ship so that the rest of the plot can happen is because Zod also abducted Lois for no reason and locked her in a prison cell with an all-access USB port to control the entire ship. Meaning that if the film's antagonist didn't kidnap this random side character and lock her in the same room with the technology to wipe them all out, then Clark would have died before the third act of this movie. Not only is that easily the worst plot contrivance in this film, but I think it might be one of the worst I've ever seen in general. And this isn't the only example of Lois being forced into a scene for dramatic leverage. Remember how the USB Clark gave her has a copy of his father's memory installed on it? Well, after she plugs it into that port in her prison cell, Jor-El actually appears to help her escape and gives her a plan to save her from Zod that she tells Clark after his fight in Smallville.
I know how to stop them.
This turns out to be the stupid black hole plan the US military actually tries using, which involves loading the spaceship Clark arrived on onto an air freighter to activate its hyperdrive and drop her onto Zod's spaceship. But for some reason the military decide to bring Lois with them when they fly the spaceship to the middle of an ongoing disaster. Again, fucking why? Why would the US military decide to bring a civilian journalist with them on a potential suicide mission to save the world? The only possible explanation for her being here is that because Jor-El told her the plan, they believe she could help them if anything goes wrong with the spaceship. But Lois already told Clark and the General everything she knows, and when something does go wrong, she has no idea what it is or how to fix it.
Something wrong, it's not supposed to do this!
Well, what's it supposed to do?
It's supposed to go in all the way!
Let me take a look.
This whole conversation could be a phone call. Why the fuck did they drag her to the middle of an alien war zone? It makes absolutely no sense for Lois to even be remotely involved in this mission, which means the only reason she's been dragged into another life-threatening situation is to generate tension from Clark having to protect her from danger. Which is an annoying trend across all Superman media, but it gets pretty ridiculous when these situations escalate to the point they start breaking the laws of physics. Lois falls off the air carrier the split second the US scientist activates the black hole device, which realistically means she should be sucked into the event horizon, but against all logic she starts falling away from it instead. Look at this. Lois is still falling to her death as the black hole is sucking up everything around her, but when Clark swoops in to try and save her, he starts getting pulled in by the gravity while she stays completely unaffected. So the audience is watching Clark desperately struggle against the pull of a black hole while Lois is just kinda sitting there. It's fucking absurd. In short, Lois Lane's character in this movie only really exists to facilitate absurd plotlines or to generate dramatic tension by nonsensically inserting her into life or death situations so Clark can save her. Which I can only assume was also supposed to build up romantic chemistry between them, but the actual dialogue of their interactions kind of ruins that.
You know, they say it's all downhill after the first kiss.
I'm pretty sure the only counts when you're kissing a human.
Alright, let's get this over with. Superman's final fight with Zod is basically just a Smallville fight scene but worse. It's a 10-minute long extended slugfest which does nothing to develop either characters and feels like another excuse to see buildings blow up, but this time on a much larger scale. There's also no sense of progression since despite how much damage they're doing to their surrounding environment, it doesn't seem like either of these characters can actually hurt each other. Clark and Zod never really react to each other's attacks outside of grunting, neither of them ever show any visible signs of injury, and there's never any sense of them actually getting tired despite how drawn out this battle is. None of these punches seem to have any impact besides just pushing them away from each other, which makes it hard to get invested in the stakes of this fight because it doesn't seem like either of them are in danger. When you look at the best fight scenes from other superhero films or action films in general, one of the things that makes them believable and engaging is that the characters involved have realistic reactions to the damage they're taking. This could be as simple as a character struggling to recover after a significantly powerful attack, or the choreography getting sloppier as they slowly exhaust themselves over the battle. It just makes the narrative progression of a fight scene more interesting if the characters are actually affected by the events happening to them, because logically, getting punched in the head repeatedly is probably going to have an impact on you. And while I understand that their superpowers give them enhanced durability, you'd think since they also have equal levels of super strength that their powers would cancel out, and it'd just be like two normal guys having a punch-up. Speaking of which, it's incredibly convenient how Zod mastered his powers so quickly. Compare his first flying attempt in Metropolis with Clark's first flight attempt in the Arctic. Also, remember that Clark's first involuntary laser vision barely managed to heat a doorknob, and now compare that with Zod's first experience. Holy shit. People have argued that his genetic programming as a soldier somehow made it easier for him to adjust to his superpowers, but as we saw from the intro, Zod's genetic programming didn't even make it easier for him to fight Jor-El, so that excuse is nonsense. This only reinforces the earlier criticisms of the World Engine plan, because if it was this quick and easy for Zod to master his superpowers, then surely that was a better option than risking the World Engine. I mean, just look how that turned out. It seems like the scriptwriters just wanted to rush through the process of Zod getting his powers in time for their epic anime fight. And that isn't just a funny expression either. In a 2017 post on Twitter, the film's lead storyboard artist Jay Olivia confirmed how the fight scenes in Man of Steel were directly inspired by the anime adaptation of Dragon Ball. This is actually pretty cool because it explains a lot of visual similarities between Man of Steel and key features of Toriyama's work. But despite the clear inspiration, unfortunately there was one crucial element that didn't make the cut.
Yeah, no one will get hurt if we fight way out here.
See, in Dragon Ball, despite the characters in the series being far more powerful and destructive, the fights themselves usually take place in vast empty landscapes. This is more than just a technical decision to make background perspective easier for the animators, as the characters in-universe specifically try to take their battles away from where people live to avoid endangering them with collateral damage. But the showdown between Clark and Zod takes place directly in the middle of the biggest city in America, which brings back all the problems we discussed in the Smallville fight because Clark clearly hasn't learned his lesson. Again, just like the disaster in Smallville, Clark never shows any concern that his actions are putting people in danger, and never tries to drag Zod away from the city despite having several opportunities. Zod doesn't even gain the ability to fly until halfway through the fight, but despite having the obvious advantage, Clark never takes this opportunity to fly Zod away from the city. When they first clash, Clark actually flies Zod into the city through several skyscrapers, and into an office block with tons of people still outside. He could have learned from his mistakes in Smallville and flown him out of the city, but instead he rams him into areas where people were still evacuating. When Zod first uses his heat vision, he completely loses control of himself and stands still as he lasers the building down. But instead of taking the opportunity to grab him and fly away, Clark just kinda hovers there staring at him. In the film's sequel, we learn that someone was still in that building while Zod was using his lasers, which means that since Clark didn't take this opportunity to fly them away, someone died because of his inaction. Again, this is a problem since, as we've discussed, a character's behaviour during a fight scene should be consistent with their values and motivations. The earlier montage tried to establish that Clark wants to use his powers to help protect people and save innocent lives, but this fight scene completely contradicts this, with him endangering hundreds of people by doing superpowered combat in a highly populated area. So the audience is somehow supposed to believe that Clark wants to save innocent lives despite making no attempt to drag Zod away from the city and having no visible reaction to the damage around him. But what's funny about this is that one of the characters does eventually take the fight away from the city, except for some reason it's Zod who drags Clark away from Metropolis and flies him straight into outer space. Then when they accidentally crash into a satellite, holy shit, what are the chances? For some reason, Clark pushes both Zod and the satellite right back down into the city again. Again, Clark is supposed to care about helping people and protecting innocent lives, but Zod is the one who drags the fight out of the city and Clark is the one who brings it back while causing a meteor shower of satellite debris. I have no idea what the people who made this were thinking.
So in that instance, this was a Superman who had only been Superman for like a week. He'd only flown for the first time a few days before that. He'd never fought anyone that had superpowers before.
Zod only learned to fly 2 minutes ago and he still managed to take them out of the city. What the fuck is Clark's excuse? Okay, let's unpack this argument. In the discourse surrounding this movie, the most common defense for the excessive destruction directly or indirectly caused by Superman is that it was his first day as a superhero and therefore he's going to make mistakes. The reasoning usually follows that it's unreasonable to criticize Clark's performance since he's only been Superman for a day, and so the audience shouldn't expect him to be especially competent. Personally, I don't really find this justification acceptable given the level of destruction. If I told you to make an omelette and came back to find the whole restaurant on fire, it's my first day as a chef wouldn't be a reasonable excuse. But the more important question here is, well, who should we expect to be competent? Because as we've broken down throughout this video, pretty much none of the characters in this film make any intelligent decisions. To recap, Jor-El preserves the technology he spent most of his life fighting against in the genes of his infant son, then sends him alone to an unknown planet instead of joining him with his wife in a spaceship or helping other Kryptonians evacuate. Zod tries convincing people to join his cause by showing them visions of their loved ones dying, then risks the entire future of Krypton's survival by trying to terraform the planet that gives people superpowers. The US military gambles on creating a black hole in their most populated city, and John Kent's parental advice gives his son PTSD. Was it their first day on the job too? Superman's mistakes don't really highlight his inexperience because the rest of the cast doesn't perform any better. And this trend only highlights the one thing all these characters have in common. Because I hate to say it, but if Superman is stupid, and Zod is stupid, and Jor-El is stupid, and the US military is stupid, and the rest of the plot is stupid, then I think the better explanation here is that the people who made this movie are stupid. I know that sounds rude, but as the old saying goes, characters are only as smart as their writers. The reason all the characters behave this way isn't because of some intentional character flaw. Their mistakes are never acknowledged or challenged with actual consequences by the plot because the people who wrote this didn't realize they were mistakes in the first place. Besides, it's not like the mistakes Clark makes in this movie are just regular emotional reactions to difficult scenarios. Most of them seem specifically contrived to drive the plot forward. Like, if I saw my mother being threatened by a group of dangerous alien warriors, my first thought would be getting her out of there, not dragging their leader to the nearest town for a mandatory action scene. If I found out a giant laser was destroying a city, my first instinct would be to stop it, not fly halfway around the planet to take out the other one in an empty ocean. These decisions weren't written to showcase a character's values or explore the consequences of their flaws. They were included to set up action scenes so the audience gets to see buildings blow up. And the scenes where they do try and explore the values and flaws of the characters are somehow even worse. Which brings us to the film's climax. After Clark drags Zod and the satellite back down into the city, seriously Clark, why the fuck did you do that? They land in the middle of a public train station where Zod attempts to kill a nearby family with his laser vision. Structurally, this scene feels intentionally reminiscent of a trolley problem, a situation which forces a character to compromise on their morals by choosing between two extremes. In this case, the film is forcing Clark to choose between killing Zod or letting this innocent family die. But unsurprisingly, the scene's actual execution fails both mechanically and thematically. Mechanically, the trolley problem relies on the situation giving the hero no other option between the two extremes. But the setup here completely fails for two reasons. Firstly, I have no idea why these people are still here. As we see in the wide shot, there's plenty of space for them to run away from Zod's lasers, so the only reason they choose to huddle in a corner instead of trying to escape is because the movie needs them to be there for narrative tension. Survival instincts be damned. Which means the whole trolley problem framework is already broken because the people in danger could just leave. There's nothing actually tying them to the tracks. But more importantly, the scene fails because the position Clark's in gives him the opportunity to avoid killing Zod, and the moral values it's testing were never even established as part of his character. Now, let's be clear. There were definitely ways Clark could have spared Zod if he wanted to. We know both of them need to breathe, so in the position they're in right now, if Clark's arms are strong enough to snap his neck, then he could easily just keep choking Zod until he passed out. As for keeping Zod prisoner, we saw earlier in the film how the Kryptonian scout ship can simulate different atmospheric conditions. So Clark or the US government could just keep Zod locked up in the same prison cells he kept Lois in. We know that ship still works because Lex uses it to create Doomsday in the next movie. So they could easily keep Zod in one of its prison cells while exposing him to Kryptonian atmosphere to neutralize his powers. With how quickly that worked on Clark earlier, he could fly Zod there right now and get him safely locked up in no time. But all this depends on Clark actually wanting to spare him, which brings us to the main problem with this scene, because thematically, the film has done nothing to establish why Clark wouldn't want to kill Zod. While it's typically understood that most people avoid killing on principle, a trolley problem is supposed to challenge a character's deeply held moral values, and nothing in this movie suggests Clark has any moral aversion to killing his enemies. There's no scene where he explicitly demonstrates or discusses his moral stance against killing, and if he was genuinely concerned that his actions would lead to people's deaths, then his lack of reaction to all of his collateral damage has done a really poor job of showing it. So when he finally kills Zod and this is his reaction, it feels wrong, because why is Clark getting sad over the guy who killed his father, tried to destroy Earth, and wiped out thousands of people? I've seen people defend Clark's reaction because Zod's death means he's truly alone as a last living Kryptonian, and while the film has established that Clark cares about his alien heritage, this value was already challenged 10 minutes earlier when he destroyed the Kryptonian Genesis Chamber. If Clark was remorseful over the loss of his people, you'd think the scene following the aftermath of a ship crash should be the better time to show his reaction. But instead he just starts badly flirting with Lois, so why is he acting like this after killing Zod? 20 minutes of meaningless destruction, all leading up to a badly contrived ethical dilemma which isn't even relevant for the characters. No wonder audiences hated it. This scene is probably where Christopher Nolan's influence on the filmmaker's creative direction is most transparent, since it seems clearly intended to imitate the finale of A Dark Knight, which gives us a perfect comparison to explain why this scene failed its premise. The final scene in Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight involves a hostage situation where the film's secondary antagonist Two-Face is holding Commissioner Gordon's son at gunpoint, and Batman has to kill him to save their lives. From a technical perspective, the scene works a lot better since the family has no opportunity to escape and Batman isn't in a position to overpower the villain without endangering the hostages. But from a thematic perspective, the reason this scene works so much better than its counterpart in Man of Steel is because Batman's moral principles and his rule against killing has been the thematic center point of this whole movie. Since the very first scenes, the film has explicitly questioned what sets Batman apart as a vigilante versus how far he's willing to go outside the law to pursue justice.
What gives you the right? What's the difference between you and me?
I'm not wearing hockey pads.
I go to Hong Kong, far from dense jurisdiction, and the Chinese will not extradite one of their own.
Batman has no jurisdiction. He'll find him and make him squeal.
The film's primary antagonist, Joker, is even specifically motivated by the sadistic pleasure he gets from making people act outside their moral values, and he directly calls out Batman's one rule against killing people as something he'll have to abandon if he wants to win.
I have one rule.
Oh, then that's the rule you'll have to break to know the truth.
Which is?
The only sensible way to live in this world is without rules. And tonight, you're gonna break your one rule.
So fittingly, the film's climax challenges Batman's principles by forcing him to abandon his no-kill rule to save innocent people. It's a great scene because Batman killing Two-Face is a relevant payoff for all the concepts the film has explored over its runtime. And the movie ends with him sacrificing his own moral principles to save innocent lives, showing he'll always be a hero who puts other people above himself. It's textbook character resolution. In comparison, the scene for Man of Steel resolves nothing because not only were there countless other ways to resolve a situation, but we've been given no reason to think the protagonist should care either way. Which might actually be the biggest problem with the film overall, because how do you write your way to the dramatic climax of a Superman movie where the audience has no idea what the character's moral values are? Despite having a runtime of 2.5 hours, by the time Man of Steel reaches its conclusion, it's impossible to say what Clark is supposed to care about and why. His entire character is just a confusing, contradictory mess, which is the main reason this film fails, since part of what makes Superman such an iconic and beloved character is his perfect simplicity. Superman's fundamental characterization as a hero who uses superpowers to save people is a central premise so instantly recognizable it inspired an entire multimedia genre. But in contrast, the character writing in Man of Steel completely fails, since his conflicting behaviour across different scenes makes it impossible to understand him or get invested in his story. And this difference between the film and its source material highlights the fundamental issue with Man of Steel's take on the Superman mythos. Because when you rewrite a character's origin story to be significantly less realistic than a children's cartoon, when you change his most influential relationships to make him feel guilty for wanting to save lives, when you write a plot that makes him ignore people in danger for a military recruitment campaign, and when your audience has no idea what your character's moral values are, that's how you fail at Superman.